All right. Hello, this is Elsa with Tim Burton. And I am interviewing Tim because he's been one of these people who's been hit with what one would call lawfare, or what I tend to call more show trials. In other words, they're showing everybody else, they, meaning Islam and the politically correct, are showing those, just like the Soviets did under Stalin, they're showing their power, they're showing, watch out, you transgress, you're in trouble. You can just see the unfairness. We need to get the system fair again. Right now, I'm fast forwarding you've done your custodial sentence, and instead of saying, well, let bygones be bygones, that's the past, you're saying, I am appealing. I want you to make people know how important this appeal is. And the other thing is, if this appeal is important, the thing is, you have really drained a lot of your resources with this trial. And you are really asking if people can help. Why is it to our benefit to help you? What good does it do me to help you? Like, what's with this appeal?
Yeah. Well, what we have to realise is that my conviction was actually a big milestone for the forces that would shut down free speech for everybody. And if I can't do something to get this reversed, then it sets a very bad precedent.
You've become this pivot point.
Important, as I say, it's because it's got implications for all of us in terms of free speech and how much we let these people get away with things like that. So yeah, this has cost me a great deal of money, as you say, thousands of pounds.
But I want to start in your childhood. Tim, I know a tiny little bit about your childhood, so I know you've always had a sense of humor. But did you always have a sense of social justice, of being willing to go out on a limb for truth and justice and things like that?
Well, I'm not so sure that that was always the case with me. I've become a lot more aware of how important it is in recent years. I think I may have taken a lot of it for granted when I was younger. I won't say I had a privileged lifestyle, but I seem to steer clear of an awful lot of the problems that beset young people when I myself was younger. So I don't want to say yes. I was the man who had to own up to chopping down that cherry tree, like George Washington. It's not quite like that. I do believe in social justice, but it's been a process for me, because it's only really in recent years that I've realised how close we are to having social justice taken away from us, or any form of justice. And I'd like to think that right now I'm doing my bit to perhaps make up for shortcomings I might have had when I was younger.
How did you wake up? Like, I understand what it is to take things for granted. If you don't run afoul of the authorities, you assume that things are as they should be. That just makes a lot of sense. But is it that something happened to you, or was it the environment around you? So what got you to wake up?
Well, I suppose the wake-up call for me was on 9/11. I was actually at a customer's premises when I saw this drama unfolding on television, and I actually saw the second plane crashing into the World Trade Center live, and it was very traumatic to see this. I mean, I'm not an American. I don't have relatives in America that I'd be really worried about, but it was still traumatic, and I thought about it for days and weeks afterwards and realised that despite everything being fine on the surface for most people, there is actually an undercurrent going on which is evil, to give it perhaps a cliched word. It's an evil undercurrent that threatens to destroy the whole fabric of our society. And it wasn't an overnight revelation. I thought about it for a while. I did a lot of research. I started to find out more and more things about Islam and how our freedoms are slowly being eroded. And I can see that, you know, if you hadn't had occasion to take a look at these things in detail, you might just go along day to day for most of your life and not really understand that these changes are taking place. But for me, 9/11 was the catalyst, and from there and all the research that I've done, I've realised there is a huge problem that is not being properly addressed by our political elites. So, and that's elites in the UK, Europe, in the United States, Canada. The problem has been, at least up to now, largely swept under the table, and problems have been misrepresented as something other than they actually are. And this is going to lead us, I think, into a very, very bad place.
But what I'm hearing is that the trigger never was anything that happened to you. You have now gotten into trouble with the authorities.
Yes.
To put it mildly, because you've gone to prison, which is not part of the traditional course of events for somebody who has not run afoul of authorities and who's lived your general lifestyle. But it was not that something happened to you that woke you up. It was you saw 9/11, that triggered you. It wasn't that your neighborhood changed into a no-go zone. It wasn't, you could have just coasted along like many of your neighbors, but something came across loud enough for you to care about other people and for you to care about your society. Is this right?
Yeah. Yes, I'd say that was a fair representation. You're quite right. I mean, nothing startling happened to me personally. I dare say if it had done at an earlier age, I might be thinking about things differently. But it was the thought that our society is being changed, and not for the better, by forces that are being hidden from most people as they go about their daily business. And I feel it's only right that if you can stand up and say something, you should stand up and say something, because if you and I don't say something else, then who will?
Yeah, that way we're connected. Some people have had a different route, like Tommy Robinson. Things were happening in his neighborhood. He stood up because things in his neighborhood, and even to a relative of his, a niece or something who was groomed in his area. So he was personally impacted. That got him going. You and I weren't personally impacted. So I'm curious, okay, first of all, 9/11, you watch this plane go into this building, you start to read and stuff, but behind you I see LibertyGB, defends free speech and opposes Islamization. Justice for, guess who? Tim Burton. Oh my God, is that a coincidence that that sign happens to be up? I think not. But LibertyGB, how did you get involved with that? Why?
Well, the more research that I did after 9/11, I gradually formed an opinion that we had a problem with Islam that wasn't being addressed. And I was looking around to see who in our society was prepared to address it on a political level. I mean, it's one thing going out into the streets and demonstrating with signs and generally making a nuisance of yourself. But I didn't feel that that was right for me. I didn't feel that that was necessarily the best course of action. What I really wanted to see was a political solution. I'm sure the political solution is there to be had if there is the will to take it. But when I started looking around, I realised that there wasn't anybody who was addressing these problems in the way that I felt they ought to be addressed. And it was only back in 2013 that I heard about LibertyGB.
That's very recent.
Well, relatively recent, yes. Yeah. Before then, there literally was not anybody in the United Kingdom, any political party, that was specifically prepared to talk about Islam in the way that LibertyGB talked about Islam. And I saw a couple of videos of Paul Weston. If you Google Paul Weston, the video is actually titled "I Am a Racist." And I know that sounds a really odd title, but what Paul Weston does is explain that because of his views, people call him racist, but in fact he's not racist at all. And during the course of the interview, this fact is made clear. But what it showed me was that I spoke about there are forces that are behind the scenes. I'm talking about people who want to shut down our freedom of speech, who don't want anything bad said about Islam or anything bad about the process that is going to lead to the Islamization of our countries. And Paul Weston, I felt, absolutely nailed it. That was one of several videos that I saw around about the time that I heard of LibertyGB. And so I got in touch with LibertyGB and said, I'm really interested in the message that you have. How can I help? And at the time, I'd been writing a few articles for a publication called New English Review. And I explained this to LibertyGB, and they said, well, would you like to write some articles for us? And so it developed from there. And since then, I have spoken on behalf of LibertyGB, as well as writing articles, and I'm just in the process right now, as we speak, of putting together some videos to enhance the message. And in fact, if you were to go to the LibertyGB website right now, you would see the first of these videos.
How long did it take you?
To do.
How long did it take you to get into trouble? 2013, you found out about LibertyGB. This is your second encounter with the law. The first one did not end in prison. In fact, it ended up in your favor, case thrown out. But when was that?
Well, that was in 2014.
Within 1 year?
Well, I had been with LibertyGB a little while, and then I ran into this first little bit of trouble. And I said to, which I will explain later if for the viewers if they like, but I spoke to LibertyGB and I said, look, I'm in trouble with the law. You probably don't want somebody who's likely to end up with a conviction on your team. So therefore, if you like, I'll resign. And LibertyGB were very supportive, and they came back and said, no, Tim, don't do that. We're going to be with you all the way, 100%. And if this goes to trial, then we will be there to support you. And they were as good as their word. Where on the day of the first trial in 2014, they were there in force. We've got quite a few supporters, signs like the ones you can see behind me. They were being held up outside the courtroom, and people passing by were being given leaflets to help them understand what was going on. And so I was saying,
could you tell people what did you do that made you run afoul of the law?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like, and it has. You're smiling. It has to do with your humor again. You could have avoided this if only you had not said something very, very mild. And the British are very used to poking fun at each other, at themselves, truthfully. And I've heard you say somewhere else all the things you could have said, which would be much, much worse. Britain to Britain. I mean, I believe you could have called them scumbags, and that would have been all right, and not illegal, and scurrilous, I believe, and I can't remember what else. But you said something else. You dared to.
Well, I did. I mean, all this came about not long after the murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby on the streets of London in May 2013. And not long after that, there was a newspaper article written in the Daily Telegraph, which is one of our national newspapers here, and it was exposing an organisation called Tell Mama UK. And the founder of this organisation, one Fiaz Magal, was reported as manipulating the figures of his organisation, supposedly monitoring anti-Muslim attacks. He was manipulating those figures to make things seem much worse than they actually were. And on the basis of that, he was getting a huge amount of taxpayers' money and using these fraudulent figures to justify his public grant. Now, I was outraged about this, and I wrote about it on Twitter, and I was a little rude about Tell Mama and Fiaz Magal. At one point, I think I called him a mendacious, grievance-mongering takia artist, and this apparently tipped Fiaz Magal over the edge. and he picked up the phone and complained to his friends in the Metropolitan Police in London, saying, I want something done about Tim Burton. And the police were only too happy to oblige, because this is a very well-connected Muslim we're talking about. Well-connected means in England he's part of the establishment. He's got an honour pinned on his chest by the Queen. It's that sort of relationship with the establishment that he's got. So when he picks up the phone and talks to the Metropolitan Police and says jump, they say how high. And I was arrested and charged and prosecuted with racially aggravated harassment, mostly on the basis of my having called him a taqiyya artist. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, well, taqiyya is a very slanderous term to use against a Muslim. Taqiyya was only used 1,000 years ago. It's not used today by Muslims. And the only people that use the word taqiyya are bigoted, right-wing, racist Islamophobes like Mr. Burton there. And when I came to court, I was able to, I was offered the services of a professor of Islamic studies in the Netherlands, a chap by the name of Professor Hans Janssen. And he basically said to the court, that is not correct. Fiaz Magal is not telling the truth, and Mr. Burton's interpretation of taqiyya is correct. And on the basis, at least partially on the basis of that evidence, I was acquitted. And Fiaz Magal wasn't at all happy about this. He wrote on his blog how he hadn't had justice, and generally whining his way for the next 6 months on his blog. And what he said was, you know, if this were ever to happen again, he says we should produce an expert of our own, the Crown Prosecution.
And they did.
Now, in the subsequent case...
And can you tell them, this is just fascinating to me, because you have, like the UK, it's a tiny little island, but it's not so tiny that you couldn't avoid Tell Mama. I mean, it isn't as if Tell Mama was right next door and the two of you were bumping into each other day by day. Joke about a tiny little island. It's just, you know, small compared to Australia, Canada, etc. So you could have avoided Tell Mama, but you chose instead to offer your services.
Yeah,
and you made a comment. So in other words, as opposed to, okay, you said something, I'm going to run scared, stay far away, you approached.
Well, I did. I mean, I was outraged, and I felt that somebody in the position of Fiaz Magal, a prominent member of the establishment, a Muslim, promoting the premise that somehow all the rest of us Britons are racist, bigoted Islamophobes who are going out there attacking Muslims, and it's getting worse, and therefore there is a need for his organisation. I mean, it's all complete lies. And I was outraged that he, in his position, would fraudulently manipulate the material that was used to determine how much of a public grant he got. And I said as much. And when it came to court, what I expected was, I mean, I did think I might have a bit of trouble getting acquitted, but in the end I was acquitted. But what I would have expected was that Fiaz Magal and his organisation would be looked into very closely, and the allegations of fraud would have been enough to shut down Tell Mama and perhaps earn Fiaz Magal a jail sentence. Now, that didn't happen, and I don't know exactly why it didn't happen, but I think it was because Fiaz Magal was extremely well connected. He had close ties with the Crown Prosecution Service, and they looked at him, I think, as one of those so-called moderate Muslims that they want to stand up and say, yes, everything is fine, we're all trying to integrate with British society, there's nothing to worry about here as far as Islam is concerned, you can go to sleep. I'm sure that they were looking at Fiaz Magal and saying, well, we need a credible voice to say exactly that. And if we start investigating him for things that would earn you and I a jail sentence for fraud, then we're going to lose that credible voice. That, I think, is what they said. So nothing was done about Fiaz Magal back in 2014 when the trial took place. His organisation wasn't shut down. It supposedly had its funding re-examined, but a year later they were back up and running with the same sort of public grant. And we're talking a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, probably over $1 million US per year, given to Fiaz Magal in order to promote this false premise that Muslims are somehow the victims of Islamophobic Britons, and that should be addressed. And he's still pushing that activity as we speak. But I'd really given up any thought of getting justice from the criminal justice system towards Fiaz Magal, and I'd more or less forgotten about it until 2016. And about just over a year ago, somebody put an advertisement under my nose, an online advertisement, where Tell Mama were advertising for a caseworker. And I looked at that with some sort of irritation, and I thought, here they are. Here's this group, hasn't been shut down. They haven't had their funding withdrawn. Fiaz Magal is still sailing along merrily, slandering all us basically tolerant and peaceful Britons, and trying to make out that we're all Islamophobic and that Muslims are victims. Now, I just thought that was a terrible premise. And there he was advertising for another caseworker, which would presumably add to the problem. So my first reaction was irritation. My second reaction, and this is probably where I went wrong, my second reaction was to say, I could do that job. How hard can it be? And I actually wrote a joke job application to Tell Mama, saying I could do that job. Why don't you interview me? I'd be a great asset to your organisation, and generally going on in this vein. And at the end of it, I said, on second thoughts, you may not want me in your organisation because I am looked on as generally honest and trustworthy, and as such, I will probably not fit into a cowboy outfit like yours. And I sent that off, and the same day I got an email back, unsigned, from somebody in Telmon, I don't know who it was, saying, cease and desist, we are reporting your emails to the Metropolitan Police. And I'd only sent one email. So I thought, well, what exactly are they alleging? There was no law broken. What would be the reason for them reporting to the police? There was no reason. But of course, they've got close ties with the criminal justice system and the Metropolitan Police, as I said. Fiaz Magal himself sits on a panel that advises the Crown Prosecution Service how to pursue cases of so-called Islamophobia. Now, the Crown Prosecution Service are the people that make the decision on whether or not to charge people like me. So there's an immediate conflict of interest there. And there's also another conflict of interest with the fact that Tell Mama advises police forces around the country on how to treat cases of Islamophobia. And so when a police force hears that there's somebody making mischief in the land, as it says in Quran chapter 5 verse 33, making mischief in the land, then he jolly well ought to be taken to task for it. And so I was not straight away, I ran into trouble shortly afterwards, as you will hear. But the thing is, if they hadn't sent that email back to me saying cease and desist, we are going to tell the police all about your nefarious activities, that is to say, writing one email, where no law was broken at all. If they hadn't said that, I probably would have forgotten about it. But they did say that, and that got me even more irritated. And I fired off a couple more emails to my eternal shame. I probably shouldn't have done, but I incorporated a little bit of satire, mockery, British humour, and I thought it was quite harmless. It's the kind of thing I would have said to anybody and just expected it to be laughed off. But of course, in this day and age, things are slightly different. You can't say just what you can to people in the way that you could when I was young, because if they take offence, then that is enough to get you into hot water. And sure enough, Fiaz Magal took offence, even though the emails weren't addressed to him in person at all. They were all addressed to his organisation. He took personal offence, and he spoke again to the Crown Prosecution Service and the police, saying, I want something done about Mr. Burton. And so I came to court again. Now, when I came to court the second time, I chose to have my case heard in a Crown Court rather than a Magistrates Court. Now, in a Magistrates Court, you have a panel of magistrates that decides on the evidence, as I did in 2014. I actually had a district judge, but it's not the same as a Crown Court. It's a lower court. And they don't take notes or anything. So when I was acquitted in the Magistrates Court, nobody had taken any notes except me. And I felt that there ought to be an official record of what's going on. And it's a higher court. And what that means is that decisions that are made in a higher court are binding on lower courts, but not the other way round. So if somebody makes a decision in the Magistrates Court, it's not binding on a Crown Court. So the fact that I was acquitted in a Magistrates Court had no bearing on the Crown Court evidence. But I felt that I would be better off being tried by a jury in Crown Court, because you don't get a jury in a Magistrates Court, you just get a panel of magistrates. And I had heard stories about the magistrates of today being given all these courses in political correctness, multiculturalism and diversity, and I felt they might not be particularly sympathetic to me. And I felt that having a jury, 12 good men and true, as we say over here, a jury of your peers, might be more well disposed to me, and we would have a full record of everything that happened during the course of the trial. So
tell me what happened. Tell me, fast forward, because there's an expectation and a reality. These 12 good men and women were not your peers. Because I know a little bit about this story. They were not your peers, and your lawyer was their lawyer.
Well, there were a whole raft of things that didn't go according to plan. Now, during the course of the trial, we actually had a witness from the Crown Prosecution Service. Fiaz Magal, as you recall, said, if ever this happens again, I want somebody from the Crown Prosecution Service to be an expert witness. And he gave evidence to the court on the subject of taqiyya. Now, I had a defence witness of my own, a chap called Dr. Sami Al-Deeb, who I'd lined up to give evidence in the court after this Crown Prosecution witness had spoken. But for some reason, my defence counsel said to me, I don't want to call Dr. Al-Deeb. I think it might confuse the jury. I acquiesced to her request, which was we didn't call my defence witness. And I think that was the first mistake that was made.
Yeah, and it would have confused people, by the way, because your witness would have said something totally different from their witness. It might confuse people, but maybe you've got the truth on your side, but you weren't able. And I know the witness that you had, you would have had an excellent, super competent witness on your side.
Yes. When you're in a court environment, it's quite intimidating, and it's quite claustrophobic because you're shut off from the rest of the court behind panes of thick glass. And so when a barrister of 20 years experience tells you that he thinks or she thinks that you should do X, you'd better have a very good reason for saying, well, no, I don't want to do X. And although I felt quite strongly that we ought to have our own defence witness have him allowed to speak, my barrister thought otherwise. And I thought, this is the person to whom I have entrusted my entire fortune, if you like, during this trial, for good or for better or worse. And therefore, I let her do what she suggested, which was, as it turned out, it was a mistake. But it wasn't the only mistake she made. as I say, the prosecution counsel, who was very competent, made a good job of blackening my character, and the defence counsel ought to have cross-examined me point by point and brought out why I had said or done certain things in the past, so that my actions could be seen as perfectly reasonable to any reasonable person. Now, that unfortunately was never done, and the jury were given the impression that was never properly dispelled that I was in fact a racist, bigoted, Islamophobic, right-wing extremist. And on that basis, the jury convicted me of religiously aggravated harassment of Fiaz Magal, and the judge sentenced me a month later, and just about everything that went wrong after that point, everything that could go wrong, went wrong, because people were saying to me after the conviction, well, firstly, you should never have been convicted because your defence counsel didn't do this, your defence counsel didn't do that, and even if you got convicted, they said you're somebody of previous good character, never been in trouble, well, never been convicted of anything in the past, and therefore, a 64-year-old man, as I was at the time, not in particularly good health, they said there's no way they're going to give you a custodial sentence for this. No way at all. How wrong they were. The judge was not in my corner at all. In fact, nobody in that courtroom was in my corner apart from some LibertyGB supporters in the court. The defence counsel made a very poor showing on all sorts of points, and the prosecuting counsel were very efficient, and the judge definitely had a bias against me, as I could tell from his comments during his summing up. So the bottom line was I ended up with a custodial sentence. But the interesting thing was that at the time of sentencing, the judge said, you referred to this particular article, which I'll talk about in a moment, an online article, and your referral to that online article was grossly offensive to Mr. Magal. And I thought, what? It's just an online article. It's in the public domain. People are free to look at it. If they don't like it, they don't have to read it right till the end. It's an article that I quoted from, and this is classified as grossly offensive. Well, that's what the judge said. And I was sentenced to 3 months, 12 weeks in prison, of which I served 6, and the other 6 were on licence. But the article to which the judge referred was an article by a Danish commentator called Jeppe Juul, and it was called Reform, Renounce or Repatriate. And the thrust of the article was that the people in Denmark see the same problems that we do here in the UK and that you do in Canada and America. And this commentator, Jeppe Juul, suggested 3 courses of action. One was that Muslims should reform their belief system. Now that seems perfectly reasonable. The only trouble is it has been tried before and it hasn't worked. There was a St. Petersburg Declaration in 2007 where prominent Muslims got together and said there's a great future for Islam if only we can get rid of the nasty bits. And they passed this declaration, but of course the Muslim world basically ignored it, because if your holy book says one thing and it's handed down from Allah to the Islamic Prophet Muhammad, then who are you as a Muslim to say that it's not perfect, and therefore it doesn't need changing? So that attempt at reform was never going to get off the ground. Well, Jeppe Juul, the Danish commentator, argued that if you couldn't reform your belief system, then if you were intellectually honest, you should renounce it. Because if you wanted to live in peace and harmony with your non-Muslim neighbours as equals in perpetuity, then there's no way you could do it if you had Islam as your guide, because Islam tells Muslims that they must treat the non-believers harshly. There's a concept which I'm sure you know about. Al-Wala wal-Bara. And if anybody doesn't know what that means, I suggest you read Elsa's articles on her website, and you will see quite clearly the implication, which is that Muslims must love other Muslims and must love Islam and everything Islamic, but they must hate. They must hate, for the sake of Allah, anything that is not Islamic. Now, that's a hell of a concept for a Muslim to follow and still live in peace and harmony with his non-Muslim neighbours. And in fact, it can't be done. If you're a true Muslim and you feel hatred, you don't feel hatred towards your neighbours, you're not actually a true Muslim at all. So there was this huge conflict between Muslims who were saying one thing on the surface, but actually feeling something underneath. And Jeppy Jewell said it would be an act of intellectual honesty if, as a Muslim, if you wanted to live in peace and harmony with your non-Muslim neighbours, you should renounce Islam altogether. And of course, Muslims do renounce Islam every day of the week, but they're in such small numbers, unfortunately, it doesn't make a significant difference to the overall problem we've got. Very well, said Jeppy Jewell, if Muslims can't reform their religion and they can't bring themselves to renounce it, then why in the West should we put up with the consequences that we see? And the consequences are obvious for anyone to see. There's jihad terror on our streets in large cities like London, Manchester, Barcelona just recently, Berlin, Nice, all of these, Paris, all of these have been subject to attacks, jihad terror attacks within the last couple of years. And by jihad terror attacks, what I mean is terror brought to our towns and cities by Muslims in the name of Islam.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward you. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. I think most of the viewers, I hope, will agree that it just makes sense that we should not put up with terror. I want you to make people know how important this appeal is, why you're appealing. It's not for your good name. You're not saying, I, Tim Burton, I'm such a delicate flower that with this stain on my character, I will just wither and die or stay locked in my bathroom forever. So I don't hear you doing this out of ego. So why are you appealing? Already,
Fiaz Magal has been on national TV crowing about how he's achieved a victory against the so-called counter-jihad movement, as he puts it. He says, you know, it took 4 years, he says. Of course, there was an event in 2013 and there was an event in 2017 and there was 4 years in between. But he made it sound like it was his personal struggle for 4 years. So he's been crowing about it on national TV. And on the back of that, he's been talking to what's called the Home Affairs Select Committee over here to try and get the views of people on the right shut down, especially on social media. And lo and behold, this is actually what we see happening, particularly over the past few months. We are seeing people's social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook being shut down for people who hold right-wing views. PayPal, a form of payment commonly used by people all around the world, has started being very selective about who it has that it extends the PayPal facility to. And organisations such as Jihad Watch, and run by Robert Spencer, and Pamela Geller's Association of Freedom Defence Initiative, they have found their PayPal facilities being removed. So the idea is to shut down free speech and to have the people who would speak out about the importance of free speech to take away their source of funding and to render them impotent. And Fiaz Magal is a big part of that.
And have you been interviewed on national television?
No. The problem we have with the national television over here is they're mostly run by the left-wing media, and they're not keen to give people like me a platform. They don't want people like me who can speak fluently and persuasively, dare I say, blowing there. They don't want people like me who can speak out against what's happening in order that it might wake up some people who might have otherwise thought, oh, there's nothing much going on, nothing to worry about. Because I can make it quite plain to my audience that there is something to worry about. We should all be worried about it. And a court case like this, with Fiaz Magal, that is allowed to stand, as I say, sets a very bad precedent. So I'm going to do whatever I can to get it overturned. Now, when I first was convicted, I started thinking about an appeal straight away. But in an initial appeal, you have to get your defence counsel to actually write to the court and say why you think the appeal should be allowed. And the problem was, of course, that the defence counsel was a huge part of why I got convicted in the first place. And she absolutely refused to write to the court to request an appeal. Now, that's not a huge problem on its own.
That is a huge problem. That is a huge part of the problem, that you can have a lawyer who basically believes in your guilt. Otherwise, she would have wanted the appeal. Yeah. She would have wanted the appeal, and she would have wanted the case overturned.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty much it. That she was not in my corner. I got the impression right from the start that she disliked my political views, and she wasn't going to do as much as she could to sell my side of the story to the jury. Yeah, she was very much against me right from the start. And the trouble is, having a defence counsel who gives a poor performance in court because she doesn't like you very much, on its own, that's not grounds for appeal. But what is grounds for appeal is something that you come across later, like a procedural irregularity. Mm-hmm. And what I found was that there was a major procedural irregularity concerning the Crown prosecution witness. Now, I spoke before about conflict of interest with Fiaz Magal. Mm-hmm. Here he is complaining to the Crown Prosecution Service and getting them basically to prosecute me, where they'd never prosecute anybody else. It wasn't Fiaz Magal pushing them. And Fiaz Magal sits on the panel that advises the Crown Prosecution Service, so that's a tremendous conflict of interest. But there's another conflict of interest as well. When we had the Crown Prosecution Service expert witness, Dr. Matthew Wilkinson, we didn't really know anything about his background, but after the trial, people did a bit of digging, and they found out something very interesting. Now, when you're giving a witness statement, or you're cross-examined in court on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service, you have to declare in advance any interest that you might have, so that the jury can weigh it up and say, he's giving this evidence, but is it as independent as all that? Well, he made out, Dr. Matthew Wilkinson made out, that his evidence was completely independent, and it turned out not to be true. He actually lied to the court, because you have to, before the trial, you have to state in writing that you are completely independent, and if you're not, then you have to give the reasons that you're not, and then the court can take them into account. Well, he didn't explain that his organisation that he runs completely separately, called Community for Curriculum for Cohesion, he didn't explain that his organisation is partly funded by, and has a patron at a very senior level in the Crown Prosecution Service. Huge conflict of interest, obviously, because he obviously wants to have his organisation to be a success, otherwise he wouldn't be soliciting patrons from the Crown Prosecution Service who give him support, material or otherwise. And on the basis that they do give him this support, he's not independent. When he gives expert witness on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service, he is not actually independent, because he's got people who support his organisation, and he's giving evidence on behalf of those same people. So that's a huge conflict of interest, and it actually amounts to contempt of court. Now, contempt of court is punishable in various ways, and the first thing you have to do is to write a contempt of court application and submit it to the court, which I have done. And what should happen then is that the contempt of court application should be processed in the usual way, and a judgment should be issued hopefully, within a short period of time, to say, yes, we're going to have a hearing on this because it's sufficiently important that it's in the public interest. Well, unfortunately, the courts have been dragging their feet. They can move very quickly when they want to. You spoke about Tommy Robinson earlier. He was the subject of a contempt of court application not so very long ago at Canterbury Crown Court. And the whole process, from the contempt of court application being issued to Tommy Robinson being arrested and having to appear in court in the next couple of days, the whole thing took less than a week. I think it was about 4 days. Mm-hmm. So the courts can move fast when they want to, but they're not. In my case, they're dragging their feet. Why are they dragging their feet? Because, in my view, because Dr. Matthew Wilkinson is a very important figure as far as the Crown Prosecution Service is concerned. And like Fiaz Magal, if he's smeared with these well-deserved allegations, they'll have one less effective person to assist them in whatever they want to do. Now, you might say, well, a tiny little insignificant case like mine, maybe that's not sufficiently important to process a contempt of court application. But that's not the point. The point is, if there's any perception of bias, any perception of conflict of interest, then that ought to be investigated. And there is plenty of British case law that actually says, yes, it must be investigated, that a judgment has been made in the past that's gone into case law and basically says conflicts of interest of this nature ought to be heard and evaluated. Now, that is what I expect to happen, but it's not happening at the moment, so we're going to have to keep pushing. But what's even more important is that Dr. Matthew Wilkinson, as a Crown Prosecution Service expert witness, has given evidence in some very high-profile trials. And by high-profile, I mean the trials held recently involving returning jihadists from places like Guantanamo Bay. Very, very high profile, and he has been employed as an expert witness. Now, why is this important? Well, because if you're employed as an expert witness and it's found that you should have declared something that you didn't, that is grounds for having the conviction overturned. Again, British case law is very clear on this. If the expert witness jeopardises the defendant, then the defendant ought to have his conviction overturned. And if that were to happen, then a lot of other defence counsellors in these high-profile cases would be saying, hold on a cotton-picking minute, my client got convicted partly on the basis of Dr. Matthew Wilkinson's evidence. Mm-hmm. Well, just think about the implications of that. That could mean that an awful lot of contempt of court applications might suddenly find their way into the legal system, and the Crown Prosecution Service would have a huge problem on their hands. So, of course, it's in their interest to play it down and to try and ignore me, but then, the law says that if somebody puts in a contempt of court application, it has to be dealt with properly. And at the moment, they're not dealing with it properly. They're trying to put it on the back burner and pretend that it's not happening and hope that I'll go away. Well, I'm not going to go away. If this video finds its way into the Crown Prosecution Service, I'm here to tell you that if you don't respond and have a proper hearing to determine how much of a conflict of interest there was with Dr. Wilkinson, then I will be taking it to a higher court, and possibly as high as the European Court of Human Rights. Now, that is my right as a British citizen, and I intend to pursue it. But the reason it's so important, as I say, it's because it's got implications for all of us in terms of free speech and how much we let these people get away with things like that. So, yeah, this has cost me a great deal of money, as you say, thousands of pounds, and hence I would turn it over to you to elaborate on that a little bit more.
I just think this is a crucial case. And it's just like Tommy Robinson. It's such a small case. I mean, mortgage application, he lied on it, almost died. They're tiny cases, but so much hangs on it. Another thing that really gets me is I think of Aboriginals in North America, Australia, who did not get justice originally. And I'm thinking that right now, this is happening to the current Indigenous people. And in Europe, like in North America, you can say we're recent Indigenous, just multi-generational. But in Europe, you are the Indigenous people. You are the vast majority in many countries, and you are not getting justice at all. The tables have been utterly reversed. It is exactly the Indigenous against whom Indigenous laws are being used. So it's not even the strangers' laws that are being used against you. Your own laws are not being enforced. You are not being protected. And yes, many people who are Indigenous are just sailing through. They have not run afoul, because if it hasn't got to do with Islam, etc., the courts tend to move quite smoothly still. It's when you go into these areas where we are in most danger. I keep thinking about something like a bridge or a structure. You can drill quite a bit of holes and the structure will hold. At some point it will collapse. And that is what is happening as the laws are being used against people for whom the laws were fought from the Magna Carta on. Like, this is so important. Your case should have been open and shut. Like, he went to the police, they laughed him out. Instead, I get news in my inbox. Somebody was beaten up, could describe who beat him up. The person who was beaten up is a 78-year-old Indigenous Brit. The person or the people who beat him up were non-Indigenous, non-Brits. If there were racism involved, you would think it would all be on behalf of the 78-year-old Brit. But no, the police won't file a charge even though he could identify. Your case, you were not beaten physically, but you deserved to be protected. So this is me saying we need to take the laws back. Another thing I want to say, and I'll say this for a minute, ever since I've gotten alert to Islam and the dangers around me, I have kept being told, be careful, be careful. They haven't used the word lawfare. You know how they are. They'll be really careful. You could get a lawsuit. In other words, the world around me, the regular world, these are often people who are not alert to Islam, who claim to believe it's not dangerous. At the same time, when I say things and they know I'm speaking the truth, do know it's dangerous, because they tell me, watch out, what you're doing could get you into trouble. Am I lying? No. Am I encouraging violence? No. Am I exploring religious texts? Yes. Should that endanger me? Well, no, it shouldn't. So what I'm saying is the whole world knows what's happening to you on one level, even as people deny it on another level. Like, you shouldn't have gotten involved with looking at Islam. Well, somebody's got to do it. So congratulations for what you've done, for what you're doing, for doing this in good cheer, for saying, I'm taking this on. But if you're taking it on, you're also taking it on, not just for me, but for those people who are not speaking out. Because we all need the law to be on our side. The whole thing about justice, and as you said, 12 men and women, I would say, tried and true and jury of peers, that should be to get us justice, not to have people against us, and not to have to walk into court afraid that courts set up over generations to try to provide justice are totally turned against those. So that's my little speech.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're quite right, is that the justice system is not doing what it was set up to do, which is to bring justice to the ordinary man or woman. Mm-hmm. I think I mentioned in the last video that we had, Elsa, that when I was campaigning on the streets in 2015, when I stood as a member of Parliament for Birmingham Ladywood in 2015, I was actually attacked in the street by 4 Muslims who disliked the fact that I was speaking out against Islam, and they stole my campaign materials. Now, I got their car registration and I reported it to the police. The police interviewed one of the perpetrators and he said, yeah, we took his campaign materials. So what? We thought that it might cause trouble if he was allowed to be campaigning. Well, the trouble is that they don't have the right to decide what or is going to cause trouble. If they're unsure about something, they should call a police officer. They don't have the right to just steal my property and then say, well, I took his property because it would cause trouble. Now that, if you applied that principle, any thief could use it in defence and say, well, I only took his DV and video recorder, Your Honour, for his own good, because otherwise he'd be watching things on it he shouldn't. And as a defence, it's totally ridiculous. But the police swallowed this defence and refused to prosecute these people who had assaulted me in the street and stolen my materials. And I actually wrote to the Crown Prosecution Service saying, I'm really not happy with the decision of the police in this instance. And they wrote back and said, well, we agree it's not in the public interest to prosecute, even though it was a clear case, not only of theft, but of street robbery. And that is something that should automatically attract a custodial sentence. And the Crown Prosecution Service did not want to know.
And you just have to go, why did this not warrant charges and stuff? Because at the same time, I think somebody threw a sandwich with some pork in it at a closed mosque door, got a 1-year sentence and died within half a year in prison. So if stealing and by the way, he didn't steal the mosque door, he didn't steal a Quran, he didn't soil any Islamic texts, he did not take all Islamic literature. And imagine if he'd gone in and stolen it for the public good, because it's much better if this Islamic literature is not around. Imagine the hue and cry, whereas your things that you had legitimately bought, paid for, that were your possessions, were taken from you. You could even say it was an act of generosity introducing them to a pork sandwich. I know it wasn't, but that would have been having a sense of humor, which I believe is generally out of bounds. You can just see the unfairness. We need to get the system fair again. And you are a voice of justice and moderation. And yes, you're very articulate. You speak out well. Your voice should be on mainstream media, as you know. It's not too likely that you're going to get 10 invitations in the next day or two.
Possibly not.
Yeah. But congratulations that you're taking it on. And I will say, when I hear you, I hear that you are taking it on in that old British spirit of justice and all, that old kind of traditional good spirit.
I mean, there's a great deal made of British values these days, and various politicians stand up and say, oh, we need people to show British values, but then they don't define what British values are. Well, I would say that certainly a sense of fair play is one of those values. And when I see things like this happening that are obviously to the detriment of our country as a whole, and it's based on the fact that the justice system and our political elites are not treating this problem seriously, then I think I have to stand up. I have no alternative. I can do no other. As I think it might have been Martin Luther who said that. I can do no other. Here I stand. And not that I really want to compare myself with somebody on the level of Martin Luther, but the point is, I see injustice and I see that it needs to be addressed, and I'm putting the tools in front of the criminal justice system, inviting them to address it. This contempt of court application ought to be properly addressed by the justice system. My conviction ought to be overturned, and at the very least I would expect a public apology. But in the meantime, it's cost me a great deal of money, and what can I say? If there is a way that some of that can be recouped, I would be extremely grateful.
Well, you're doing it for all of us. You are. Will I be next? Will my neighbour be next? Will my friends be next? Will your notary, or barrister, whatever you call him, for taking on your case, will somebody find some loophole to charge your barrister for taking you on? All of these things, that there's often a figurehead who stands for ever so many of us.
Yes.
And that is, in fact, what a show trial is. On their side, the show trial is to show the rest of us. On our side, the show trial is, if you can win, we are all safer.
Yes. I think that sums it up well, Elsa. And therefore, I think, you and I, we're duty bound to do whatever we can. I certainly feel I am. And this is part of that fight. And we need to do whatever we can to win it, because of the implications to freedom of speech and to our freedoms generally, and ultimately to the whole concept of having a democratic system in the United Kingdom. All of this,
not just in the West or in the world. And I will say, like you, I did not choose to take this on. I did not go out looking for it. My awakening was with the Danish cartoons. It was like, what is going on here? This doesn't make sense. But the more I learned, the more I went, this is serious. This is serious, and this is happening. I can disregard it. But actually, I couldn't. It's just like you. I couldn't disregard it. This was really happening. So the question really, for me and for you, is what do I do here? You went and you joined LibertyGB. You went and you wrote. You got one prosecution. Now, kind of accidentally, you're dealing with this. But you've become this pivot point that if you can get things overturned, you can get all kinds of people looked at. You can get maybe other things overturned. You can get more things known. So quite a lot hangs on this. I want to thank you for the interview, and may justice prevail.
Well, indeed. I mean, if anybody out there feels they can help the cause, if they go to the LibertyGB website, libertygb.org.uk, there is a big blue button there where you can help the Legal Defence Fund, and every penny that you can spare would obviously be very welcome. But I'd like to thank you, Elsa, for having me on your interview, and hopefully we'll get a chance to speak again very soon. Well,
there is going to be another chapter. Somehow or other, something else will happen. And yes, I want to keep everybody updated.
Very good.
Take
care. Well, thank you, Elsa.
Thank you.